Welcome to this explainer. Today we are diving right into historian Eric Hobsbawm's fascinating world-shifting thesis on how a mere 60 years completely forged the modern world we live in today. We're looking at the period from 1789 to 1848. Now I know that might sound like a simple slice of history, but as we're going to see, it was an absolute earthquake that dismantled the old world and built an entirely new one in its place. To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this transformation, we just have to look at the contrast. Before 1789, the world was pretty static and overwhelmingly agricultural. Kings ruled by divine right, and people, well, they were mostly just subjects, born into a social position they kept for their entire lives. Fast forward just a few decades, and you've got this dynamic, rapidly industrializing era dominated by factories, mass politics, and citizens who firmly believe they have rights. So how on earth did humanity make such a massive leap in such a remarkably short amount of time?
Well, here's our game plan for today. 1. The pre-revolutionary world. 2. The French political earthquake. 3. The British industrial engine. 4. The collision of ideologies. And finally, 5. 1848 and the modern world.
Hobsbawm famously frames this era as the dual revolution. And this is key. He argues that these two massive distinct transformations were happening at the exact same time. On one side, you have the French Revolution completely transforming politics and society. On the other side, you've got the Industrial Revolution in Britain completely transforming production, work, and everyday life. Together, it's like a massive historical one-two punch that collectively built the foundation of the 19th century and, by extension, our entire modern world.
Let's start with Section 1, the pre-revolutionary world, or basically, life before 1789.
Picture Europe in the late 18th century. It was a slow-moving, overwhelmingly agricultural society. Most folks lived in small villages, worked the land, and political power was tightly held by monarchs and a few traditional elites. But beneath the surface, the gears were definitely starting to turn. Trade and population were expanding. A wealthy middle class was emerging. And crucially, you had these bold Enlightenment thinkers beginning to actively discuss radical concepts like reason, liberty, and equality. They were quietly setting the stage for a total upheaval, challenging the very idea that a king should rule just because, well, he was a king.
Moving right along to Section 2, the French political earthquake, from subjects to citizens.
You know, revolutions usually don't kick off with abstract philosophy, right? They start with empty stomachs and empty national treasuries. By 1789, France was dealing with severe debt, a deeply unequal tax system where the privileged classes essentially paid next to nothing, and skyrocketing food prices. For everyday people, a political crisis at the top very quickly became a literal question of survival at the bottom. When King Louis XVI called the Estates General to try and fix the finances, it sparked a wild chain reaction. The Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, the Bastille was stormed, and the old political structure simply collapsed.
With the old regime falling apart, France was attempting something entirely new and, frankly, extraordinary. They were destroying centuries of feudal privileges to rebuild a society fundamentally organized around three radical steps: liberty, equality, and citizenship. They issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, loudly proclaiming to the world that sovereignty actually belonged to the people.
But hey, revolutions rarely move in a straight line, and the French Revolution escalated fast. What started with the Estates General and the Bastille led to the fall of the monarchy and the birth of a republic. But to defend these explosive new ideas, the government resorted to extraordinary violence during the Reign of Terror. Eventually, this whole radical phase just burned itself out, paving the way for a very ambitious general named Napoleon Bonaparte to swoop in and seize power.
And this right here is the absolute irony of the era. Napoleon became an absolute emperor, which seems like a huge step backwards, right? But as his armies marched across Europe, they brought the Napoleonic Code with them. This system of legal modernization actively dismantled traditional feudal institutions in other countries. It proved to the entire world that old political systems could be totally torn down and reinvented. It spread the incredibly dangerous idea that a nation is made up of citizens with rights, not just subjects who obey. Which brings us to Section 3, the British industrial engine and the rise of the factory.
Now, while France was busy tearing up the political rulebook, Britain wasn't storming castles. They were building machines. Britain really had the perfect recipe for industrialization. They combined a thriving commercial agriculture sector and robust financial institutions with abundant natural resources, specifically coal and iron. Add in their access to massive overseas markets through their empire, and you have the perfect environment for groundbreaking new machines, powered by steam, to completely revolutionize how things were made.
But the Industrial Revolution didn't just change production. It fundamentally changed human time itself. Think about it. For centuries, human life was dictated by the sun, the seasons, and maybe the local rooster. But as production moved into sprawling factories, the clock took over as the ultimate master. Workers now had to arrive at highly specific times, pacing themselves to the relentless, completely unnatural rhythm of the machines. Strict discipline and rigid schedules became the center of everyday life.
And this brings us to a massive demographic shift. The factory system birthed an entirely new social class, the industrial working class. Yes, industrial capitalism created extraordinary, unprecedented wealth, but it was incredibly uneven. Millions of newly minted wage workers poured into rapidly expanding, smoke-filled cities like Manchester. They were entirely dependent on selling their labor, often enduring grueling long hours, dangerous conditions, and highly unstable pay. Modernity was officially here, but for many, it came hand in hand with staggering poverty.
All right, Section 4, the collision of ideologies, or the battle for the 19th century.
So what happens when you take the dual revolution, meaning millions of new industrial wage workers living in difficult conditions, and expose them to the French Revolution's radical political ideas about liberty and equality? Well, you get immense social friction. You get the central, burning questions of the era. Who should actually benefit from all this crazy new industrial wealth? And who should control the political power to decide?
Naturally, the traditional elites tried to slam on the brakes. After Napoleon was finally defeated, the old European monarchies held the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Their goal was pretty simple: put the revolutionary genie back in the bottle. They desperately wanted to restore legitimate monarchies, prevent any more French-style revolutions, and crush this pesky new concept called nationalism. But the reality? They failed. The new economic and social realities made returning to the past totally impossible, and revolts just kept bubbling up through the 1820s and 30s.
What happened next was that this era birthed the major competing blueprints for organizing modern society. You had conservatives fighting for stability in traditional monarchies. You had liberals demanding constitutional governments, individual freedoms, and property rights. You had nationalists wanting to unite people with shared histories into their own independent nations. And you had socialists emerging directly from the struggles of the working class, focusing on economic equality and totally new forms of social organization. Educated Europeans and growing trade unions were fiercely debating these four distinct visions for the future.
And that leads us to our final section, Part 5. 1848 and the modern world, the springtime of peoples.
All of this built-up pressure, it finally blew the lid right off. Everything we've discussed, the political expectations born in France and the deep class conflicts born in British industry, collided in a dramatic climax. In 1848, an event known as the Springtime of Peoples occurred. A massive, truly unprecedented wave of uprising swept through major cities: Paris, Vienna, Berlin, Budapest, Prague. For a brief, shining moment, diverse groups of liberals, workers, and nationalists united, and the old European order looked like it was going to completely collapse. Now, as soon as the old regimes wobbled, those revolutionary coalitions actually splintered over their different goals, and conservative forces were able to crack down and regain control. But, and this is absolutely crucial, it was a point of no return. Even in defeat, the revolutions of 1848 locked in the foundations of modern mass politics. Nationalism kept growing, industrial capitalism kept expanding, the working class became a permanent political force, liberal and socialist politics took deep root, the era of the isolated absolute monarch was fatally wounded, mass political participation was now simply unavoidable.
I love how historian Eric Hobsbawm brilliantly summarizes the era. He says, by 1848, the future had become something different, something that could be invented. The dual revolution didn't just build factories and write constitutions. It instilled the truly radical idea in ordinary people that history isn't just a storm that washes over you. It is something you can actively participate in. It is something you can fight to change.
We are literally living in the world the dual revolution created. Our modern corporations, our wage labor, our definitions of citizenship and human rights, they are all the direct aftershocks of these intense 60 years. We are still navigating the conflicts between capital and labor and between different visions of government today. The world crossed a major threshold in 1848, proving that society can be completely reinvented. So, the really provocative question for us today isn't whether massive change will happen again, but rather, what kind of change will come next? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this gives you a powerful new lens for looking at our world today.